Hello and welcome to So French, the show about the twists and turns, intrigues and insights to all things French.
This week we're bringing you a special Winter Writers Edition with a special guest and at a very special place. My name is Stefan de Vries.
And my name is Sara Bertilsson. What do Brigitte Bardot, Karl Lagerfeld and Picasso have in common with So French? Well, they're all regular consumers of coffee, champagne and cognac at the exact same spot as where we are recording this episode right now.
We are just having a coffee and a croissant now, but we are in the world-famous Café de Flore in Paris' 6th arrondissement on its left bank. It's now almost a tourist trap to anyone slightly interested in France, Paris and post-war philosophy, but still a mythical place.
Absolutely. And with us today, at this mythical place, Agnès Poirier.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
You're a journalist and author. You're also a contributor to British, American, French and other international press. And the reason why we've invited you today is because you're the author of the book Left Bank, Art, Passion and the Rebirth of Paris, 1940 till 1950. It's almost a declaration of love to the decade where Paris and it was more or less the center of the world. Is that correct?
It's true, yes. And I'm a bred and born, or born and bred. I'm a born and bred Parisian.
Where were you born? The right or the left bank?
I was born on the right bank.
Oh, so
yes,
you're a traitor.
I'm a right bank kid.
Maybe we should explain the fact where it comes from, because it's very simple. It's the
right bank is the south. The right bank is the north of the Seine River, and the left bank is the south.
Yeah, and it's the direction in which the river flows to the sea.
Exactly, a bit
simple.
like London. We should call it the left bank, really, but they call it the south bank, where the National Theatre.
It would be the right bank because it flows the other way. It flows into the north.
Oh, you're right.
Oh, you're
from east to west.
Okay,
that's right. I always mix up left and right, east and west.
Have coffee to talk about that.
But so you wrote a book about this part of Paris, and more specifically the area where we're now in, the left bank, the Rive Gauche, Saint-Germain-des-Prés. But first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a born Parisian, you just told us, but you write mostly in English. You also live partly in London. You must be schizophrenic.
Completely. That's the right word, actually. That's the word I'm usually using to describe myself. Yes, I have spent half my life in Paris, the first half, probably the most important half, and the second half in London. And I'm now commuting between the two. So I studied in London history, a PhD at the LSE, and straight away I started reporting and being a London correspondent for the French daily press, Le Figaro, Le Monde, Libération, etc. And then I wrote a few books about the differences between France and Britain. How we did things in opposite ways, and somehow, one of my books was picked up for translation rights in Britain, and that's a funny story because the translation was terrible.
From French to English. From French
to English. Yeah. That is to say, when I say terrible, is that the humor had been left aside. The translator hadn't understood at all what it is to be French and how you write and the spirit in which you write in a language. So it was just a succession of words, and I told my lovely publisher Weidenfeld and Nicholson, I said, over my dead body, you cannot publish this. It will be the end of my publishing career. I suggest to write on the same subject, but for a British readership in English. And he said, okay. So I did it, and it was a book called Touché, A French Woman's Take on the English, which was quite successful in Britain. And so I suddenly realized, you do write differently if you have your British hat on or your French hat on. And because I'm now, I've spent half my life in both countries, I feel completely comfortable and yet completely alien in both countries. I'm an observer. And it took me 10 years to actually come out of that niche of having to explain France and Britain and writing about France and Britain. We all know the Peter Mail's A Year in Provence or A Year in the Merde, right? By Stephen Clark.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I felt that I had said everything I had to say in terms of books about how we French and we British are different, and we keep bickering and so I wanted to write a history book. So it's a completely different venture for me, and it was quite painful because it took 3 years of my life, but it was extremely rewarding too.
Yeah. Now, before we dive into that wonderful book about the left bank, tell us a little bit more about the place we're here now, the Café de Flore. It's a bit old-fashioned cafe. The espresso costs €5.
Well, yeah.
But
it wasn't always the case.
It's served in a very, very nice...
Yeah, it's very nice, I must say. Very nice porcelain, and it's all very fancy. But it's a little bit old-fashioned. But why is this place so mythical? What's...
So Café de Flore and the nearby cafe called Café des Deux Magots have been here for a very long time. I mean, Café des Deux Magots actually was opened more than 100 years ago. They often belong to the same family, the French cafes. And what happened is that during the war, the reason why it became so popular, not because they were special cafes, just because it was warm.
Oh, really?
They had a stove. And this is what I'm trying to do also in the book, is to show Paris as it was. That is to say, not glamorous. We have an idea of Paris in the 50s, so glamorous. But it wasn't glamorous at all during the war. It was extremely cold. And that's why a lot of young writers, artists, very often, they try to be very discreet with the Nazi occupiers, because some of them didn't have legal papers, and they knew that they'd be warm and they could stay. And actually, it didn't cost a fortune at the time, so you could have. They didn't have coffee during the war. Obviously, they had some sort of chicorée and sort of ersatz of coffee, but the waiters were very kind and let them, as long as they had one coffee, they could stay for 7 hours if they wanted, and there was a stove right in the middle of the room, and hence the myth and the legend about those two cafes.
Is it still there, the stove? I don't
no,
really
it's
see
not.
It. Oh, it's gone.
Not.
Oh,
no, now central heating.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, now it has been transformed into very much a landmark on the South Bank, where a lot of tourists, of course, come. But there are still quite a few regulars, I think.
Yeah, I think Café des Deux Magots is really the tourist trap today, with a lot of American tourists from Texas, among others. But no, Café de Flore has remained a place for Parisians. A lot of tourists too, but you meet local people and publishers, because the reason why Left Bank is so important, I mean, we're talking about cafes, but this is not what really is important. There are cafes everywhere in Paris. Yeah. What is important is the heart of the publishing world and universities, of course, since the Sorbonne, since the early Middle Ages. So this is why the Left Bank is so important.
Yeah. And now you went also to Sciences Po, right?
Yes, I did.
That's right around the corner.
Exactly.
Did you already come here when you were a student?
Well, that's interesting you're saying this. Actually, on the first day I went to Sciences Po, I was in my early 20s, and so I wanted to debunk the myth of Café des Deux Magots. So I went there, because I would get, at the time, 35 francs for my lunch, and that's exactly what cost a café crème. So I didn't have lunch that day, but I went early, 8 a.m. And I didn't go back again. So I did it once, realized there were Texan tourists, and I thought, okay, well, I've done it. It's done now.
Yeah.
But Café de Flore, I come occasionally, yes, because it's still, quite authentic.
Yeah.
Well, so your book about the Left Bank, it's pretty much portraits about these people who worked and lived in this area during that decade between 1940s and 1950s. we're all familiar with their names. It's Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, but also Miles Davis and a bunch of other people. But I was just wondering, what made you feel, because these are all sort of household names and they've been very studied and, written about. What did you feel in their stories was missing and what was still lacking to be told?
Well, when I, started looking at this story and the topic, I realized, as you're saying, every single individual in my list of characters has had hundreds of monographies. But there wasn't a book that actually joined the dots between all these people because they all knew each other. They all influenced each other. And, it was a sort of cross-cultural fertilization that I hadn't read anywhere. And, you don't actually put on the same page. You don't know necessarily that Giacometti was best friend with Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, and Giacometti showed his first, walking man to them. They were the first to see it, You don't know about, for instance, Jean Kelly and politics. Jean Kelly and Jean-Paul Sartre. You would think, what? Yeah. Did they know each other? Did they like each other? Yes, they did.
Yeah. Did they dance together?
Well, you know what? This is also what I discovered. They love dancing. Albert Camus loved dancing. Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenon. Thank you. No, phenomenologist. You say that. Anyway, philosopher, loved dancing. And a few other. There's this British philosopher Aya, who also came to Paris to dance in the jazz clubs. So you discover all these things, and so I wanted to join the dots basically. And we're talking about Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, but there is also Norman Mailer, Saul Bellow. The sculptor Calder, there's Juliette Gréco and Miles Davis, Giacometti and Picasso and Jean Cocteau and Brigitte Bardot. I mean, very, very, yes, at the end of the book, when she's 15, she makes a sort of guest star appearance. Françoise Sagan as well, because they are right at the end of the book, opening up on a new generation. But there's also Jacques Jaujard. Jacques Jaujard opens the book. He used to be the director of the Louvre Museum, and he should have a statue really in Paris because he single-handedly saved the entire public collection. Because he knew the Germans were going to invade France. I mean, he knew from the mid-30s. And he had been responsible actually for overseeing the safekeeping of the Prado collection during the Spanish Civil War. So he knew a bit about that kind of operations. And in 1938, he didn't tell his bosses or, the state. And just before the war was declared in September 1939, the entire public collection was dispatched, gone, and hidden. And saved. And nobody remembers Jacques Jaujard. So what I'm trying to say, there are 32 main characters in the book, and some very well-known ones, obviously, but also some lesser-known, like Dominique Horry and Edith Thomas. Both of them lovers. There are a lot of, actually, triangle and ménage à trois or ménage à cinq, or a lot of love stories between all these people who really influenced each other.
Do you think that the sort of these stars like Camus or Sartre, de Beauvoir, have they sort of hidden the collective work behind this movement? Is that what you're saying, that some of the people have been sort of forgotten or left behind, or because they became such stars?
Well, yes, some of them completely eclipsed the others. But at the time, for instance, Arthur Koestler was a lion of literature at the time, and he's almost forgotten today. I mean, we remember what Darkness at Noon, of course, because it was a very important thing. But at the time, François Mauriac, the great French writer, said that his book, Darkness at Noon, and Arthur Koestler changed the outcome of the referendum in 1946 in France, and therefore that there was a chance
that was
that
about
the communist, the new
vote,
constitution.
Right?
No, it was about the
okay.
new constitution of the Fourth Republic, and the communists were extremely powerful in France. But that book, he says, or he said, tilted, the result against the communist proposition of the Fourth Republic's constitution. We can say that some books have historical consequences, and we can talk about The Second Sex, of course, by Simone de Beauvoir, that was published a few years later, and of course Camus and Sartre. But yes.
And were those people already stars in the 50s? Sartre, Beauvoir, Miles Davis, etc.
Well, Miles Davis was very young. He was in his early 20s when he came for the first time in Europe with Dizzy Gillespie, and that was the beginning of bebop. So because in the book there's jazz, there's music, there's literature, there's philosophy, there's politics, there's sculpture, there's painting. I mean, we're talking about so many different disciplines. And Miles Davis was at the beginning of bebop. And let us not forget that at the time it's French critics that gave really what we call lettres de noblesse to not only the bebop movement that was emerging at the time, but also to Sidney Bechet and what we call New Orleans. They were not considered as artists at all in America. And of course, there was the racial segregation. But in France, as a bit what happened in cinema when French critics started saying, but Hitchcock is a master, Nicholas Ray is a master. They were considered as what mere entertainers,
And Miles Davis
just
made
performers. And you're going to talk about Miles Davis and Juliette Gréco.
Yeah, no. I was about to say that Miles Davis also made the soundtrack of L'Ascenseur pour l'échafaud
Absolutely,
movie.
in the late 50s.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how did that
That
come?
was improvisation.
It was Louis Malle, was the director.
Louis Malle,
Did they met here then, or how did that work?
Well, the book stops in 50, so,
Okay.
and that happens 9 years after the book. But
Our listeners will have to read your next volume.
and Jeanne Moreau replaced Juliette Gréco in the heart of Miles Davis. But Miles Davis, for him, it was almost, the most important time of his life when he came to Paris, because he realized that he was considered as American, not as a black musician, but as an American artist and a great artist. And when, just to explain that very French attitude to the arts and to culture in general, when Louis Armstrong came just a few weeks after Dizzy Gillespie at Salle Pleyel in Paris to a sold-out concert. Well, for him, they organized for him to meet with Sartre and Picasso and Beauvoir, and also Richard Wright, a great black American writer who had settled in Paris, and also the Negritude, great writers, Léopold Senghor and Aimé Césaire, because they thought Louis Armstrong is a great artist and he should meet with, the crème de la crème in Paris, which is kind of strange today. Yeah. You would think, he will only be interested in meeting perhaps his fellow jazz musicians, but no. So it's interesting because they were treated so badly back in America. That's why they loved France so much.
And it's interesting as well if you look at France today, because France is not sort of known as a colorblind country. There are a lot of talk about France doesn't manage to to the problems with integration and racial issues, etc. But you give an idea that there was some kind of color blindness.
It was colorblind, actually. If France has a problem, it's probably with its population of Arabic origin. Okay, but
there was also in a time when the colonies
black.
Yes,
but somehow, during what Richard Wright had no reason really to want to settle in Paris. He didn't know the language. There was no connection. The only connection, when he was young, he remembered all the talks from the First World War's veterans, black Americans, who were treated by France completely differently than by the American army. They were not allowed to use rifles against the German enemy, because the German enemy was the enemy, but it was white. Also, the French army gave the greatest medals to black American soldiers, because they didn't make any difference between the two. And so Richard Wright talks about the veterans coming back to America and saying France was such, we were treated like Americans, not like a second-class citizens. Yeah. So I would argue that France doesn't have any, problem of integration with anyone of African origin. It has a problem with its, former North African and Arabic colonies, I would say.
Yeah. Now, it was a real melting pot at the time. Was it also maybe sort of a bubble? I mean, how relevant were these intellectuals and artists for non-intellectuals, for the, let's say, the normal people?
Well, I mean, of course you can always talk about bubbles, when a capital city is concerned, because it's not what happened, in the provinces. But it was less of a bubble if you look at the number of copies they sold. We're talking about millions. So imagine philosophy books being sold on that scale. Also, what they said in Paris had echoes everywhere in the world, much more so than today. When a French philosopher talks today in Paris, it doesn't have echo in the whole world. And they were also translated, in 30, 40 languages. And it's not the case anymore. So,
have people lost interest in philosophy and the search for? Is it more quick answers today than
I think it's
the interest in
convergence.
Search?
It's a numerous. It's different things. But when you look just at translation figures today, it's very shocking. France is a country where about 20. If you go to any bookshop in France, between 20 and 25% will be translation from non-French books in all categories. If you enter a bookshop in Britain or in America, it's less than 2%. So France is still very much interested in the world conversation. Britain and America today are not. But at the time, I mean, I don't know the figures for the time, but all I know is that Americans were reading, Sartre and Beauvoir and Camus, and if we had the same people today, they wouldn't be translated, and therefore wouldn't be given so much importance. It's a question of because Sartre didn't speak English, Camus didn't speak English, Simone did,
So that's a bit of a paradox, because it was actually a very global movement, very open to the world, and the world opened up to them. And now in the time of globalization, it's the other way around, actually. We don't hear about German or French or Spanish philosophers in our other countries.
Well, we do hear,
Well, if
about
you really want to.
And for France, maybe.
No, absolutely.
But is it that the Anglo-Saxon culture then has taken a full grip over the world today?
And it has also become more insular. I mean, you just look at politics too. It's it goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
An insular country will produce insular politics, inward looking.
Yeah.
Remember Eden, the British Prime Minister. He spoke 5 languages, and at a time when it was quite handy to speak Russian and Farsi, because he had studied in Oxford. Well, today,
Yeah. Now, there's another paradox that in France, these intellectuals nowadays are being used in more a nostalgic way. People are longing back to a lost time. But isn't that just the opposite for which they stood for, to break with the past? And now they're actually part of they've become monuments as well themselves.
You're talking about
Sartre, Beauvoir.
Well, Sartre in France has a dodgy reputation. When you're French, Sartre comes with a baggage. Probably because in the 50s and 60s he embraced, he was a fellow traveller of the Communist Party, and it took him a very long time to actually distance himself. Camus had the great luck of dying early from a very young age.
It's always good for artists. To die
yes,
young. Yeah.
It's good. In a way, in retrospect, it was very good because he had this sort of pure image of very handsome, obviously, but also of having not made the mistakes that Sartre made afterwards. Same goes in some part in some measure for Simone de Beauvoir, but Richard Wright also died pretty young. What was your original question?
No, I mean, that is a paradox that they were trying to be modern, break with the past, and now they're actually part of the past. They have become maybe what they hated. Probably
because there are no Sartre anymore, and people with a vision. Very often I'm asked if there are still intellectuals in France, and of course there are intellectuals, but people with actually a world vision like Sartre, and also with such an audience. No, they don't exist anymore. We have very bright people, we have people, intellectuals, but who can comment on the news and make sense of the news for us. But with a world vision, no, I can't think of any, really. Or there are, pretty dodgy people like Chomsky.
I was thinking when I was reading that, these people, they were sort of looking for a search for some kind of third way between then communism and capitalism and all of that. And then I started thinking about, today we have Emmanuel Macron. Is he the answer that, Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre and all of these people were actually looking for?
Well, we've always been looking for the third way, and I thought you were going to talk about Tony Blair, but Macron is a very relevant, name. Well, I concentrate on the 40s, and at the time, and I'm very admiring of those people who failed in the end, but they tried so hard. And when you think that Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, before choosing sides, because they all in the end parted and didn't talk to each other again, Kessler and Camus and Sartre and Beauvoir. But they, for a very long time, for a few years, they really tried to find a way that was not communist, that was not fascist or imperialistic American. And they actually pushed something that happened. It's Europe. Because when Jean-Paul Sartre said, okay, enough talks, and enough, all I do is talking, but now let's act. And he founded a political party called Rassemblement Démocratique Révolutionnaire, which is kind of naive when you think about it, as if there could be a revolutionary center. And that's probably what Macron thinks. It can be on the centre and be revolutionary, but I quite like this idea of the revolutionary centre.
The famous en même temps.
Exactly.
Both, everything at the same time.
And they, in their manifesto, they said what we need is an independent Europe, independent from communism, from the Soviet Union, and independent from our American friends. And so, in a way, they were visionaries because
sort of paving the way for the European Union.
And that's why I end the book with an encounter between Theodore H. White, who was this great American journalist who came to see the implementation of the Marshall Plan in Paris and to report back in America. And he goes and meets Jean Monnet, and he says, "I've never been so impressed by a head of state who is not a head of state, but who has the power to influence head of states, because he is a man of ideas." And actually, the expression power broker comes from White, who coined it for Jean Monnet, and it entered the dictionary. And so I end the book on that positive note, although this is the age of Brexit. But,
well, that can be positive as well. All depends on what's going to happen.
Yeah, we shall see.
So do you think that's their legacy? It's sort of like a European idea?
Perhaps the third way is the European Union, and a federation. And as Victor Hugo, who was perhaps the first revolutionary centrist, wrote in the 1880s, he said, "United States of Europe."
Yeah. So did Winston Churchill in 1948. But
exactly, absolutely. So at least they tried. I mean, Sartre actually put a lot of his own money, in that party that in the end he had to wrap up, and it didn't last very long. It lasted 2 years, and then of course there was Gary Davis, that young 27-year-old American veteran who stormed the first assembly of the UN in '48 in Paris, and said, "We need a world government. We need to issue world citizens' passports," and he did that until his death a few years ago. And Camus and André Breton and Richard Wright embraced his cause at the time. It didn't last very long, but for 2 years he was in Paris issuing passports, world citizen passports. He said, because that's the only answer to the end of wars. That's even more ambitious than the United States of Europe.
Was that because he drank too much champagne here in the Café de Flore?
No, I don't think so. He was no.
He was a serious idealist.
A serious utopian, yeah.
Yeah. Now, what happened after the 50s? Paris lost its relevance. It's no longer the center of the world, although the French don't really like to admit that. What's the position of France now in the global world, in the culture, philosophy, economy?
Well, I think it's important for average country. France is an average power. It still has a voice, perhaps because it has a place at the UN Security Council, and so when Jacques Chirac said no to the war in Iraq, it had resonance throughout the world. So when something happens, I think France is still playing a part. With Emmanuel Macron, we saw that his actually election was such a wonderful thing in the world today. That is to say, sort of,
revolutionary centrist.
No, but a breath of fresh air, and also the idea that the rise of populism is actually not inevitable. Mm-hmm. That there is hope.
And is there a possibility that this golden age could actually return, or do you think it's something that belonged to a certain time, in history?
I do. Yes, but something new, something different could emerge that might have some recollection of that time. But I don't think history can repeat itself in the same way.
Is there an equivalent nowadays in Paris or in other big capitals of the Café de Flore, or is it just maybe Facebook?
Well, that's. I was going to say there must be a sort of 2.0 internet Café de Flore, a sort of world conversation. Could be Twitter, but then at Café de Flore you were not anonymous. You came in the flesh, and therefore you didn't insult the others. So let's take the best of Twitter, and that's probably the new Café de Flore.
But they don't serve coffee at Twitter.
No. No, but you've got pictures of cafes.
That's Instagram. You're mixing things up. Yes. Okay, well, that was great. Thank you very much, Agnès. Your website is agnespoirier.org, and your most recent book is Left Bank, Art, Passion, and the Rebirth of Paris 1940-1950. Excellent book to read in the Christmas holidays.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agnès Poirier.
Well, that wraps up this edition of So French. We hope you have enjoyed it. And please follow us on Twitter. It's at So French News. You can listen to us on all the regular podcast platforms or on our site sofrench.news.
And don't forget to rate us on iTunes, and please leave a review. That way more people will find us. If you happen to be in Paris, you can also listen to us on air on World Radio Paris every week on Monday at 12:30 p.m. and 8 p.m.
And if you do like French music, check out our free playlist on Spotify, which we update regularly. Just search for So French Music or click the link on our websites.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks with another Winter Writer special.
Absolutely.
We hope you'll join us then. Thanks for listening.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.